The world expected Catherine to deliver a polite announcement, a routine update wrapped in royal grace. But what unfolded left the press breathless, scrambling, and stunned into silence. With a calm voice and unshakable resolve, Catherine revealed something no one anticipated, an organization the late Queen Elizabeth personally hid from the public for decades. A charity cloaked in secrecy, protected by a select few, and tied to a mission that challenged the monarchy's future. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. And as Catherine's words settled over the room, a sudden realization swept across the reporters. But an eruption of truth so powerful that even seasoned journalists struggled to comprehend the scale of what they were hearing. She began with an uncharacteristically direct tone, revealing that the conference had been arranged without the usual palace coordination, a move that instantly generated murmurs from the press, who sensed the tension radiating from her controlled composure. There was something unmistakably heavy in her voice, something carrying the weight of secrets too long buried. When she uttered the phrase, "Her Majesty's deepest secret," confusion spread like wildfire. Reporters exchanged glances, unsure whether they had misheard or whether Catherine had just crossed a threshold no royal had dared approach in decades. Yet she didn't hesitate. She didn't soften her delivery. Instead, she pressed forward, revealing the existence of a hidden charity created during the Queen's final years, an effort that had never appeared in public records, annual reports, or royal briefings. A silent creation born out of Elizabeth's private fears and deepest convictions. The room erupted instantly. Hands shot up, voices overlapped. Cameramen stumbled forward for a better angle. Journalists demanded explanations, details, motives. Anything that could make sense of what sounded like a story pulled from the darkest corners of the monarchy's inner workings. But Catherine offered no additional clarity. She refused to answer hurried questions, choosing instead to let the magnitude of her revelation settle like a storm cloud forming over Buckingham Palace. Reporters attempted to push for more, but she remained anchored in a calm that only heightened the drama. It was clear she had prepared herself for this moment, even if the rest of the world had not. Within minutes of her announcement, social media detonated. Clips spread across platforms with millions of views accumulating in real time. Hashtags tied to the monarchy surged. Commentators speculated wildly, while supporters and critics alike tried to interpret Catherine's measured expression, her precise wording, her refusal to elaborate. It was a moment that felt less like a press conference and more like the opening chapter of a royal reckoning, one that promised revelations capable of reshaping the monarchy from the inside out. And as the nation held its breath, the weight of Catherine's disclosure signaled that what lay beneath this hidden charity was far more explosive than anyone could have imagined. But Catherine's announcement was only the beginning, because the truth behind this secret charity went far beyond anything the monarchy had ever admitted. Behind Buckingham Palace's polished facade, a handful of loyal figures carried a secret heavy enough to reshape royal history. Catherine's revelation exposed only the surface, but the real power sat with those who protected the late Queen's clandestine mission. For years, they operated quietly, driven by loyalty, fear, and a promise made directly to Elizabeth herself. And while the public believed every royal initiative was carefully documented and openly managed, this hidden charity lived in the shadows, shielded only by 5 individuals whose identities were never recorded and whose roles were never acknowledged. They acted as guardians of the Queen's unspoken will, bound by her unmistakable command that this mission must remain unseen until the kingdom truly needed it. They were chosen not for convenience, but for their unwavering loyalty. Individuals the Queen trusted above, advisors, ministers, and even family. Yet Catherine was not one of them, a fact that deepened the mystery and raised questions about when and how she uncovered the truth. Those who had served the Queen noticed subtle signs over the years: late-night letters sealed with Elizabeth's personal crest, couriered across the palace with instructions that could never be entered into official logs. Aides spoke in hushed tones of directives so cryptic that even they couldn't decipher the Queen's full intentions. But they obeyed without hesitation, knowing her instinct for secrecy was rarely misguided. Everything surrounding the charity was engineered with cold, meticulous caution. Donations were routed through unnamed benefactors, leaving trails that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Financial experts who attempted to trace these funds would later admit the accounts felt untouchable, protected by layers of clearance only a monarch could authorize. The purpose behind such elaborate concealment sparked countless internal rumors, but no one dared challenge the Queen's command. Her words, once spoken, were law within her chosen circle. Catherine's late discovery, however, hinted at deeper fractures within the royal household. Some believed the Queen had intended to bring her into the fold, but never found the moment. Others suspected that certain factions within the palace had deliberately kept Catherine in the dark, fearful of the influence she could gain if she knew the full scope of Elizabeth's intentions. What made her revelation even more unsettling was how prepared she seemed, emotionally steady, confident, and armed with knowledge that should have been inaccessible to anyone outside the Queen's original protectors. The fact that she stood before the world and exposed a secret even senior royals barely understood sent tremors through the hierarchy. It suggested she had not merely stumbled upon the truth, but had made a deliberate choice to act on it, stepping into a space that had long been guarded and controlled by others. As whispers spread through the palace in the aftermath of her announcement, it became painfully clear that Catherine's involvement signaled a seismic shift. The 5 guardians who once held the charity's existence in their quiet hands were now forced to confront a new reality, one in which Catherine possessed knowledge they never expected her to inherit. Some viewed it as a violation of the Queen's original wishes, while others saw it as the fulfillment of something Elizabeth had quietly intended but never revealed. And as the nation struggled to grasp what Catherine had exposed, those within the palace found themselves returning to the same question. Why had Elizabeth created something so hidden, so guarded, so carefully separated from the world she governed? The answer, as Catherine's boldness made clear, lay not in the secrecy itself, but in the crisis that had shaped the charity's very existence. To understand why the Queen concealed this charity, we must go back to the moment it was born from a crisis no one ever spoke of publicly. Long before the world sensed any instability, Queen Elizabeth saw a danger rising within her own kingdom, one she feared would fracture the very identity of the monarchy. In private letters, she referred to it simply as the silent erosion. And it was this quiet emergency that pushed her to create a charity she believed could heal Britain in ways the Crown no longer could. While the public saw a nation moving forward, Elizabeth saw cracks deepening beneath the surface. She recognized a shift in the country's emotional landscape, a loss of trust that no speech, no public appearance, and no traditional outreach could repair. Her advisors insisted the institution remained solid, that the monarchy's influence was stable. But she understood the truth far earlier than any of them dared admit. People were beginning to turn away. In the privacy of her study, Elizabeth monitored the growing crisis with a quiet urgency, tracking reports of communities slipping through the cracks of support systems. She noticed rising disillusionment in families who believed the monarchy had forgotten them. She felt the distance widening between the Crown and the public, and the thought tormented her more than she ever let on. Behind closed doors, she held hushed conversations with faith leaders and scholars who warned of a spiritual exhaustion spreading across the nation. They described a population craving guidance, but no longer trusting the institutions meant to provide it. These voices shaped her understanding, making her realize that this was not a momentary concern, but the beginning of a profound cultural drift. Elizabeth's frustration stemmed from the realization that traditional charities, though well-intentioned, were failing to reach the people she worried about most. She saw organizations overwhelmed, underfunded, and disconnected from the individuals who needed them most urgently. In her eyes, this widening gap represented more than a failing system. It represented the monarchy's inability to serve its people in the way she believed they deserved, and that was something she could not bear to accept. She refused to let the Crown's influence decay quietly, unnoticed and undefeated by forces it didn't understand. If the institution she had devoted her life to could not adapt publicly, then she would find a way to adapt privately. Working in secrecy, she gathered a small circle whom she trusted implicitly. She made them swear absolute silence over what she was about to build. She envisioned a charity with no name, no public face, no recognition, only purpose. A network that moved quietly, offering support without seeking praise or validation, reaching those who had fallen so far into isolation that they no longer believed anyone cared. This initiative, hidden from every political eye and every public document, became her personal mission. It was her shield against the collapse she feared, her attempt to preserve the moral foundation of the crown, even if the world never knew it came from her. Catherine's later discovery of this effort revealed far more than a secret charity. It exposed the Queen's deepest fears, her private doubts, and the emotional weight she carried as she watched the monarchy face challenges it wasn't prepared to meet. Through the letters and directives she left behind, Catherine uncovered a woman battling not just public pressures, but an internal terror that history might regard her reign as the beginning of the monarchy's unraveling. That fear drove Elizabeth to construct something extraordinary, something separate from the crown yet deeply tied to its survival, something she hoped would mend the wounds she felt growing across the nation long before anyone else acknowledged them. But the Queen's plan wasn't merely compassionate, it was strategic, and it demanded complete invisibility. Hidden in plain sight, the charity operated under layers of aliases, encrypted communications, and covert partnerships. Its work touched thousands who never knew the benefactor behind their salvation. Catherine's disclosure peeled back a fraction of the secrecy, but the network Queen Elizabeth built was far more complex and more powerful than anyone imagined. What Catherine stumbled upon was not a simple act of generosity, but a sophisticated underground system designed to move silently through the cracks of society. Every pathway, every transfer, every message had been tailored to avoid detection, allowing the Queen to intervene without drawing suspicion. It was a structure built for invisibility, a living shadow that served its purpose without ever revealing its architect. The financial flow alone revealed the depth of Elizabeth's strategy. Funds were routed through anonymous donors connected to discreet royal accounts that had existed for decades yet were rarely touched and almost never questioned. Expert auditors would later admit that the transfers were so cleverly concealed that even a trained investigator would have struggled to identify their origin. The Queen ensured that every donation appeared mundane, insignificant, or mistakenly categorized, blending flawlessly into the noise of bureaucratic chaos. For those who benefited, the aid arrived without explanation, often at the exact moment they felt abandoned. What looked like coincidence was, in truth, meticulous design. To keep the operation intact, Elizabeth relied on secret meetings held far from the palace's polished corridors. Some took place in rural estates where confidentiality was easier to maintain, while others occurred in off-the-record locations known only to those she entrusted. During these gatherings, plans were shaped, needs were prioritized, and routes for assistance were established. The intermediaries involved were selected with extraordinary care, individuals trained to conceal royal involvement so thoroughly that no trace could be tied back to the monarchy. They were instructed never to reveal who sent them or why they appeared. They existed to deliver hope and vanish without recognition. The charity's focus reflected issues the monarchy publicly ignored. It reached individuals who had fallen into emotional, economic, or social isolation, people who felt invisible to the institutions meant to protect them. Elizabeth knew addressing these struggles openly would ignite political backlash, particularly from those who believed the monarchy had no place, interfering in societal inequalities. She feared that revealing the truth behind her involvement would not only derail the charity's mission, but spark a storm of criticism that could damage the institution she had spent her life preserving. Her secrecy was both a shield and a necessity, a way to do the work she believed mattered without attracting enemies who would dismantle it. Catherine's later discovery of encrypted files, documenting the entire operation, confirmed how intentional and thorough the Queen had been. Buried within these files were names, dates, coded transactions, and personal notes from Elizabeth herself, outlining why each action had been taken and what she hoped it would accomplish. Reading them, Catherine realized the extent of the Queen's sacrifice. Elizabeth had shouldered this burden alone, refusing to expose anyone else to the political and emotional weight of her mission. The encrypted records were not merely evidence, they were a confession, a roadmap, and a warning left behind by a monarch who foresaw the battles her successors would face. However, secrecy always carries a price, and that cost began to surface after Elizabeth's passing. When Queen Elizabeth died, the hidden charity lost its anchor, and the power vacuum it created triggered a quiet internal war. Senior royals clashed behind closed doors, advisors panicked, and Catherine found herself caught between tradition and truth. The question wasn't just who would lead the charity, but whether it would even be allowed to survive. The Queen's passing left more than emotional devastation. It left a structural collapse, a sudden absence of the one person who understood how the charity worked, why it truly existed, and what dangers came with exposing its purpose. Without Elizabeth, the carefully constructed secrecy began to splinter, revealing tensions that had been suppressed for years. In those early days of mourning, the palace became a battlefield of whispered arguments and veiled accusations. Each faction convinced their view reflected the Queen's intentions. Catherine walked into rooms where silence alone carried judgment, where loyalty was measured by how much of the truth one believed should remain buried. Some royals argued that the charity must be dissolved immediately, insisting that its existence posed an unpredictable threat to the monarchy's image. They feared scandal, scrutiny, and questions they weren't prepared to answer. They saw the charity as a risky piece of Elizabeth's legacy, one that lacked the structure and transparency demanded in the modern age. But others believed the charity was the Queen's final vision for the monarchy, a blueprint for moral influence the institution desperately needed. They argued that dismantling it would erase the last chapter of her reign, a chapter she had chosen to write in secrecy because she saw dangers rising long before anyone else acknowledged them. These conflicting beliefs created a raw divide, one made even sharper by the knowledge that the Queen had left behind sealed directives meant to be read only by select members of the family. Catherine's world shifted when she learned she had been mentioned in one of those directives. The revelation came quietly, delivered with hesitation by a senior advisor who looked unsettled, simply placing the document in her hands. In that sealed letter, Elizabeth described Catherine not as an outsider to the mission, but as a potential guardian who might one day understand why secrecy was necessary and why transparency, at the right moment, could reshape the monarchy's bond with the people. It was a message layered with trust, expectation, and an unmistakable hint of succession, not of titles, but of moral responsibility. And it was this unexpected endorsement that changed everything. Yet the king was not convinced. He expressed doubts about keeping the charity alive, worried that its exposure would create scrutiny the institution was not prepared to withstand. His advisors warned that any link between the monarch and secret financial networks could spark political instability. They insisted that Catherine's involvement could be interpreted as overreach, a breach of boundaries that threatened internal unity. The tone inside the palace shifted. Every move Catherine made began to be watched, weighed, and whispered about. She could sense the discomfort her determination created, especially as she refused to step back from what she now understood to be Elizabeth's final plea. Still, she didn't falter. With every new document she uncovered, every note written in the Queen's familiar hand, her resolve hardened. She realized that Elizabeth had foreseen this conflict, had predicted the resistance, and had prepared Catherine for the storm long before she even knew she was stepping into it. Her posture, once gentle and reserved, now carried a quiet fire. That shift alone shocked the royal household. Some saw defiance, others saw destiny. But all of them sensed that Catherine was prepared to do something unprecedented, something that would push the monarchy into a confrontation it could no longer avoid. But Catherine's next move would overturn every assumption and ignite a firestorm. In a private archive the public never knew existed, Catherine uncovered the Queen's handwritten letter addressed not to a monarch, but to a woman she believed would one day carry the crown's moral burden. The words inside shattered Catherine's doubts and pushed her toward the dramatic revelation she finally delivered to the press. It happened after a tense disagreement with senior staff, a clash that left Catherine feeling deliberately obstructed, as though certain figures within the palace feared the truth as much as they feared the consequences of silence. Driven by instinct more than protocol, she went to a restricted vault she had only heard whispers about, a place reserved for documents the monarchy believed too sensitive for any formal archive. Accessing it required invoking authority she rarely used, and that alone signaled just how far she had been pushed. Inside that vault, tucked beneath stacks of sealed files, she found a small envelope marked with the Queen's personal crest. Its weight was light, but the aura it carried was unmistakable. Elizabeth had written this not as a sovereign bound by duty, but as a woman who saw the approaching storms with a clarity no advisor shared. As Catherine opened the letter, the inked handwriting revealed more than instructions. It revealed trust. The Queen described Catherine as the bridge between crown and people, a phrase that struck Catherine with an almost overwhelming force. In those few words, Elizabeth captured the role she believed Catherine would someday embody, not through title or lineage, but through moral conviction and emotional intelligence. It was a responsibility Catherine had never imagined the Queen saw in her, yet it was now laid bare in the most intimate of confessions. Elizabeth warned of future instability, of fractures within the nation and within the monarchy itself. She wrote of a silent shift she believed would test the crown's relevance, and of communities whose suffering would deepen if the institution failed to act. Her language was urgent, but also painfully honest. She confessed fears she had never spoken aloud, fears about a world changing faster than the monarchy could respond. And then came the most critical directive. Catherine was to reveal the hidden charity only when silence becomes harmful. The phrase echoed inside Catherine, igniting a resolve she had not felt before. It was clear that the Queen had foreseen a moment when withholding the truth would jeopardize not just the charity's mission, but the moral foundation of the monarchy itself. As Catherine continued reading, her emotions surged. The Queen's vulnerability spilled across the page in a way Catherine had never witnessed. Elizabeth admitted she could not guarantee the charity's survival after her passing, and feared that internal power struggles would bury it before its purpose was fulfilled. She expressed hope, but also anxiety that Catherine, if she ever discovered the truth, would have the courage to act even when the institution trembled around her. These lines cut through Catherine's lingering doubts. Every hesitation she once held evaporated. She understood now that her decision to go public wasn't defiance, it was fidelity to the Queen's final, unspoken wish. The letter clarified everything. It showed that Elizabeth had deliberately chosen Catherine not for symbolic reasons, but because she believed Catherine possessed the heart, clarity, and courage required to protect something born from quiet suffering and profound love for the people. It explained why Catherine's instincts had felt so right, why her resolve had only strengthened despite the backlash. Elizabeth had prepared her for this moment without ever saying a word to her directly. And now, with the truth in her hands, Catherine knew the revelation she had delivered to the press was only the first step. But Catherine knew the revelation alone wasn't enough. She had to expose what the charity truly did. The hidden charity wasn't a symbolic gesture, it was a lifeline. From forgotten youth to abandoned communities, countless stories were rewritten by the Queen's silent generosity. And as Catherine prepared to reveal its impact, it became clear that Elizabeth's mission was far more personal, powerful, and transformative than anyone ever suspected. This was not a project built from political obligation or royal tradition. It was born from a monarch's heartbreak, her unspoken grief over a nation she felt was drifting away. The deeper Catherine looked, the more she realized the Queen had poured herself into helping those who had been left behind by society's vast and unforgiving gaps. Every document Catherine read, every encrypted note she decoded, carried the undeniable fingerprint of a woman who refused to let suffering go unseen simply because protocol demanded distance. The charity supported families in crisis whom the system had overlooked, parents who had slipped into despair, children battling circumstances so heavy they felt swallowed by them. In one case, a single mother drowning under debt received a sudden lifeline that prevented her from losing her home. The assistance came without explanation, without a name attached, and yet it arrived with perfect timing. In another instance, a teenager battling addiction received access to treatment that would have been impossible without silent intervention. These were not random acts of compassion. They were carefully chosen, tracked, and followed by intermediaries who ensured that each person not only survived, but had a chance to rebuild. Traditional institutions saw numbers. Elizabeth saw people. The charity's reach extended further, funding shelters that had been on the brink of closure. Emergency health care for individuals deemed too complex for existing programs, and emotional counseling for those who had slipped through every bureaucratic crack. Catherine found records showing that Elizabeth personally reviewed select cases, sometimes writing brief notes in the margins, small phrases that revealed both pain and determination. She wrote blessings for families she would never meet, encouragements for individuals fighting invisible battles, and reflections that showed how deeply their stories moved her. These handwritten touches revealed a side of the Queen the public never saw, a woman fighting quietly against despair, using secrecy as a tool to protect the vulnerable from the political storms that might erupt if her involvement ever surfaced. When Catherine eventually met some of the beneficiaries, individuals who unknowingly received royal aid, the encounters left her shaken. These people spoke with humility, gratitude, and disbelief, never imagining that their lives had been touched by the monarch herself. Their voices trembled as they described the moment hope returned, often without understanding where it had come from. Hearing their stories, Catherine felt the emotional weight of what Elizabeth had built. She realized that revealing this charity would not only honor the Queen's memory, but also give the monarchy something it desperately needed: humanity. Not the symbolic kind performed for cameras, but the quiet, raw, unfiltered kind that changes people's lives. Catherine knew that sharing these stories would dismantle the distance that had long existed between the crown and the public. It would show the monarchy not as an institution trapped in tradition, but as a force capable of compassion, sacrifice, and understanding. It would transform public perception in ways no speech or public initiative ever could. But it would also expose the monarchy to scrutiny it had avoided for years. Revealing these stories meant acknowledging the cracks Elizabeth had spent her final years trying to mend. It meant admitting the institution's failures, its blind spots, and the pain it had overlooked. Catherine understood that once this truth was shared, nothing would be the same. Yet revealing the charity's purpose was only part of Catherine's plan. Her final move was the most shocking. The palace wasn't united behind Catherine's decision. Her revelation threatened reputations, strategies, and long-protected secrets. Senior figures feared exposure. Advisors warned of backlash, and whispers of betrayal simmered beneath the palace walls as Catherine pushed forward, refusing to retreat. The shock of her announcement had barely settled before dissent rose like a tidal surge. In corridors that once echoed with ceremonial calm, tension now pulsed like a living force. Some believed Catherine had crossed a line that royalty never crossed, lifting the veil on something deliberately buried. Others insisted she had done exactly what the Queen had intended, even if no one had been prepared to confront the implications of that truth. The divide grew sharper with every passing hour, turning the palace into a landscape of conflicting agendas and rising anxieties. Some senior royals accused Catherine of overstepping her authority, insisting she had taken a private matter and thrust it into the public eye without proper consultation. They argued that revealing the charity jeopardized the monarchy's stability, its delicate balance of influence, and its centuries-old tradition of keeping internal affairs shielded from scrutiny. Their frustration was rooted not only in what she revealed, but in the power it gave her. If Catherine truly held the Queen's intentions in her hands, then her influence extended beyond her title, and that frightened those who feared losing control of the narrative. Stepped into a position they had not granted, and yet one Elizabeth herself might have chosen for her. Advisors, meanwhile, painted a grim picture. They predicted political criticism, media frenzy, and questions the palace would struggle to answer without unraveling even more hidden truths. They warned that every story Catherine revealed about the charity would force the monarchy to confront its own failures. Failures the public had long suspected, but the institution never acknowledged. To them, Catherine's determination wasn't courageous. It was reckless. They urged caution, restraint, silence. But Catherine remained unshaken, relying on the Queen's letter as both guidance and shield. Every line written in Elizabeth's hand strengthened her conviction that this moment was not a breach of protocol, but a fulfillment of duty. Behind closed doors, heated arguments erupted. Voices rose in meetings that once followed strict decorum. Some demanded she step back and let the matter settle quietly, while others insisted ignoring her would only inflame the situation further. Each confrontation left Catherine more aware of the resistance she was facing, but also more aware of why the Queen had hidden the charity so carefully. Elizabeth had foreseen this storm. She had predicted the struggle, the fear, the anger, and she had trusted Catherine to navigate it with a steady heart. It was this silent endorsement that kept Catherine grounded, even as pressure mounted around her. Meanwhile, the press fueled the chaos. Speculation grew daily, with journalists dissecting Catherine's every word, gesture, and absence from public events. Stories surfaced about factions within the palace, about tensions rising between senior royals and Catherine's camp. Commentators debated whether she was emerging as a reformer or a disruptor. Each headline intensified the strain inside the monarchy, turning private disagreements into public narratives that no one could fully control. The more the media speculated, the more desperate some factions became to silence Catherine before she revealed anything further. Yet, Catherine refused to be intimidated. Instead, she began preparing a final statement, one she knew would silence every critic, finalize the Queen's legacy, and force the monarchy to confront truths it had avoided for far too long. She crafted her words with precision, guided by the Queen's letter, by the stories of those the charity had saved, and by the unshakable belief that transparency was no longer a threat but a necessity. As she prepared for this moment, the palace braced itself, sensing a shift approaching that could redefine the monarchy's future. And that final declaration would send shockwaves through the monarchy, sealing the Queen's legacy and Catherine's own rising power. As the world waited, Catherine stepped forward once more, this time not as a duchess or princess, but as the heir to the Queen's most personal mission. Her closing, the statement, wasn't just a revelation. It was a promise, a declaration that the hidden charity would not die in secrecy, but redefine the future of the crown itself. There was a shift in her presence, a quiet authority that drew the entire room into stillness. She knew the weight of the moment. She knew every word would echo far beyond the walls around her, and yet she spoke with the steadiness of someone who finally understood her purpose. For Catherine, this wasn't about challenging the monarchy. It was about fulfilling a responsibility the Queen had entrusted to her long before anyone else recognized it. In this moment, she wasn't representing tradition. She was shaping its transformation. She began by vowing to continue and expand the hidden charity, describing it not as an artifact of Elizabeth's private life, but as a living mission that demanded protection and growth. Her voice carried a conviction that silenced any lingering doubt. She explained that the charity had been designed to serve those who felt unseen, unheard, and forgotten, and she promised that its reach would grow wider under her care. Catherine then made a bold announcement: she would take personal involvement in the charity's operations. She would not supervise from a distance or delegate responsibility to committees. She would work directly with its network, ensuring that the Queen's original intentions were honored rather than diluted by politics or bureaucracy. The declaration marked a dramatic departure from traditional royal detachment, signaling a new era where action took precedence over ceremony. Then came the moment no one expected. Catherine revealed that the Queen's handwritten letter, the one that had guided her, emboldened her, and ultimately reshaped her path, would be partially shared with the public. The room fell silent as she read the line describing her as the bridge between crown and people. It was the first time the world heard Elizabeth's voice on this secret, and the effect was instantaneous. Critics who had questioned Catherine's motives found themselves confronted by the Queen's unmistakable endorsement. Advisors who once warned against transparency realized that the Queen herself had paved the way for Catherine's choices. And senior royals who opposed her were left without ground to stand on. Public reaction surged with overwhelming support. Messages flooded in from communities touched by the charity. from individuals whose lives had been changed without ever knowing who was behind the help they received. People applauded Catherine for exposing the truth with courage rather than caution. In a world often divided by fear and suspicion, her openness felt like a breath of honesty the nation had long been starved of. And as Catherine continued, she framed the charity not as a deviation from royal duty, but as its renewal, a moral foundation upon which the monarchy could rebuild trust, relevance, and authenticity. With each word, Catherine transformed the Queen's secret into her own legacy. She spoke of Elizabeth's compassion, her foresight, her fears, and her unwavering belief that the monarchy must evolve if it hoped to endure. She made clear that the charity was not a hidden rebellion, but a hidden blueprint, a way forward that placed humanity at the center of royal responsibility. And now, by bringing it into the light, she claimed that blueprint as her own. What had once been a clandestine operation became, through Catherine, a symbol of renewal. Her final pause carried the weight of everything the monarchy had been and everything it still could become. And as Catherine stepped away from the podium, one truth became undeniable. The late Queen's most protected secret had found its rightful guardian. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.